Hey guys, tonight I need you to do something for me before we begin. I need you to close your eyes for just a moment. Picture her. You know exactly who I mean. The little girl with the dark braids flying loose behind her, the sunbonnet hanging down her back by its ribbons because she never could stand to wear it properly. The log cabin sitting small and steady in the middle of a wood so thick and green, it feels like the whole world ends at the tree line. Pa by the fire with his fiddle in his hands, drawing out a tune that sounds like everything is going to be all right. You have known that picture your entire life. Now open your eyes, because tonight I am going to show you the photograph underneath that painting. The real one. The one that someone worked very hard to make sure you would never see. Tonight we are talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder. Not the one who lived in the books, the one who lived in the world. The one who picked up a soft pencil in the spring of 1930, opened the first of many lined school tablets, and began to write down every single thing that the little house books would later decide America was not ready to hear. What she wrote in those tablets was the truth, and the truth, it turned out, was going to take 84 years to reach you. Get comfortable, drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Tell me if you grew up reading the Little House books, or if you're hearing this story for the very first time tonight, because what I am about to tell you is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in American literary history, and I want you fully present for every word of it. She's 63 years old when she sits down to write the real version. The year is 1930. The kitchen at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, smells the way old farmhouses smell in early spring, of old-like wood smoke and damp earth coming alive again after winter. The light through the window is thin and grey. Her husband Almanzo is outside somewhere, doing the slow, careful work of a man who has not been fully well in over 40 years. Their farm is modest. Their savings are thin. The previous October the stock market had collapsed, and the world outside that farmhouse window is a different, harder world than it had been just a few months before. Laura sits at the kitchen table with a stack of lined school tablets she has purchased at the general store, and she begins to write. Not the cheerful, lamp-lit fiddle music version of her life, the real one. She writes in pencil, in a matter-of-fact hand, in the plain-spoken voice of a woman who has survived enough to have no patience left for softening edges. She does not write like someone performing for an audience. She writes like someone settling a debt with the truth before there is no more time to pay it. Page after page after page, week after week. By the time she is finished, she has nearly 400 handwritten pages in front of her, approximately 74,000 words. A full life, from her earliest memories as a 2-year-old in Territory, Kansas in 1869, all the way through to her marriage at 18 years old in August of 1885. She calls the manuscript Pioneer Girl. On May 7th, 1930, she hands it to her daughter, and that is where the story takes its first turn toward the dark. But before we go there, we need to go back further, because if you want to understand why those 400 pages spent 84 years in the shadows, you first have to understand who wrote them, and who she really was underneath the sunbonnet. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls was born on February 7th, 1867, in a log cabin in Pepin, Wisconsin. The big woods of the books were real. They were dense and magnificent, full of the particular silence that only old forests carry, and in her earliest years, that cabin in those woods was genuinely home. She would remember the smell of those trees for the rest of her life, the sound of the wind moving through them at night. The way Pa's fiddle music filled the small space and made the dark outside feel like something warm and familiar rather than something to be afraid of. That part is true. Hold on to it, because truth and mythology are going to weave in and out of each other tonight, and you're going to need to know which is which. Her father, Charles Philip Ingalls, was born in 1836, a man of magnetic warmth and genuine restlessness in roughly equal measure. He had large hands and a broad laugh, and a talent for making everyone around him feel that the next place would be better, the next season would be kinder. The next 160 acres of prairie would be the farm that finally held. He was a man who believed in horizons the way other men believed in foundations, and believing in horizons meant in practice that the Ingalls family moved. Over the course of Laura's childhood, they moved 17 times in approximately 14 years. Wisconsin to Kansas, Kansas back to Wisconsin, Wisconsin to Minnesota, Minnesota to Iowa, Iowa back to Minnesota, Minnesota to Dakota Territory. Over and over, uprooting and resettling, leaving behind whatever small thing had been built, always moving toward the promise of something better just beyond the sight line. Every time they moved, they left something behind. A garden, a neighbour, a season's worth of labour, a grave. In the books, all this moving is adventure. It is Pa's fiddle calling them toward the next horizon, and the family following joyfully, because the pioneer spirit does not tie itself down. In the real story, much of the moving happened because the farm they were on had failed, because the crop had not come in, because the debt had grown too heavy, because Charles Ingalls, restless and optimistic and perpetually undercapitalized, could not make the land produce what his family needed to survive. That distinction matters. It is the engine that drives this entire story. The grasshoppers arrived in 1874. You need to understand what that meant. The Rocky Mountain locusts that descended on the Great Plains in the summers of 1874, 1875 and 1876 were not a nuisance. They were a catastrophe. They arrived in clouds so dense they blocked out the afternoon sun, turning the sky the colour of old brass, and they descended on crops with a mechanical absolute thoroughness that left nothing. Grain fields that had stood green and promising in the morning were bare dirt by evening. Gardens, orchards, hay stored for winter livestock. The wooden handles of farm tools left outside, all of it consumed. Across Minnesota and the surrounding territories, families who had staked everything on a season's harvest found themselves with nothing, literally nothing. No food for the winter, no feed for the animals, no crop to sell, no crop to replant. The debt that had already been accumulating on borrowed seed and borrowed time became, overnight, impossible. The state of Minnesota established relief programs. The federal government provided aid. Families who had moved west on the promise of self-sufficiency found themselves lining up for government provisions, signing declarations of poverty, accepting assistance from the very institutional machinery that the frontier mythology insisted they did not need. Charles Ingalls signed such a declaration. He declared himself and his family destitute. That document exists in the historical record. It sits in the county records, quiet and permanent. A piece of evidence that nobody went looking for in the years when the Little House books were America's primary way of understanding what pioneer life had actually been. In those books, there is no declaration of destitution. In those books, the grasshoppers come, and the family suffers, and Pa goes to work away from home for the summer to bring in money, and they survive, and spring comes again with its clean promises. The frontier rewards virtue and patience. The government is not part of the story at all. Laura knew differently. She had been 7, 8, 9 years old during those plague years. She remembered the sky going dark. She remembered what came after. She put it in Pioneer Girl. She put all of it in. And then there is Freddie. This is the part that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it says something important about what we lose when history gets cleaned up for consumption. And Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie by everyone who loved him, was born on November 1st, 1875 in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. He was the fourth child of Charles and Caroline Ingalls and the only son. The family had 2 older girls, Mary and Laura, and a younger one, Carrie. Freddie was the boy, the one who would carry the name forward, the one his mother would later say, decades later, with the quiet devastation of someone who has lived long enough to know exactly what was lost. Yeah, that everything would have been different if he had lived. He was never a healthy baby. He had convulsions from early on, the kind that strike without warning and leave a mother standing in a drafty farmhouse with her hands shaking, watching a small body seize and go still, and then, if she was lucky, start breathing again. On August 27th, 1876, he stopped breathing for the last time. He was 9 months old. He died of diarrhea, what the frontier called summer complaint, the bacterial illness that killed children in frontier communities with appalling regularity because contaminated water and inadequate medical care made it essentially unstoppable. He was buried on the farm of his uncle, Peter Ingalls, in Wabasha County, Minnesota. His exact grave location is not known today. The farm was later destroyed by flooding. Laura wrote about his death in Pioneer Girl with the same plain, unadorned directness she used for everything else. But little brother got worse instead of better, she wrote, and one awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. 12 words. 12 words for the death of her baby brother, written with the economy of a woman who had lived with that grief for over 50 years and had learned, over those decades, that grief does not require decoration. In the Little House books, Freddie Ingalls does not exist. He is not born. He does not die. He does not appear anywhere in the series at all. His life, 9 months long, beginning in a farmhouse in Minnesota and ending in that same farmhouse in the middle of a plague year, when his father had just signed a paper declaring his family destitute, is simply absent. The books skip from Plum Creek to Silver Lake, as if the years in between, the years that held Freddie and the locust plague and the government relief declaration and the family's collapse, had never happened at all. When you read those books as a child, you did not know you were missing him. That is the point. That is what erasure does. It does not leave a hole you can feel. It just removes the thing and closes the space around it so seamlessly that you never know to look. Laura knew. She always knew. And in 1930 she put him back. There is one more place the books do not take you. Between the Plum Creek years in Minnesota and the settlement in Dakota Territory, there is a gap in the Ingalls family's story. The books pass over it in silence. No chapter, no explanation, just a quiet jump from one set of years to the next, as if nothing happened in between. What happened was Burr Oak, Iowa. The family arrived in Burr Oak in 1876. They arrived because they had nowhere else to go. The grasshoppers had destroyed the Minnesota farm. The debt was insurmountable. Charles Ingalls had been offered work managing a hotel called the Masters Hotel in Burr Oak, a small farming community in northeastern Iowa, and he took it because there was nothing else to take. That hotel sat directly next to a saloon. Laura was 9 years old when her family moved into that hotel. She spent an entire year watching what happened at the intersection of frontier poverty and frontier whiskey, and what happened was not the warm, lantern-lit domestic life of the books. She watched drunken men become violent men. She saw a neighbour, each so far gone in his drinking that he had moved past anger into a kind of methodical destruction, pour kerosene through his own bedroom while his wife screamed. She saw another man set himself on fire. She saw a neighbour in town try to assault her. She was a child. She saw a childless couple offer to take her, to bring her into their household as a servant, framed as an opportunity, and she understood at 9 years old exactly what that meant and what it was not. She wrote about all of it in Pioneer Girl, and when the books were written, not a word of it made the final cut. Burr Oak, Iowa is not in the Little House series. That hotel, that saloon next door, that year of watching the worst of what poverty and desperation could do to people. The 9-year-old girl who navigated it with her eyes open and her instincts sharp, because that is what frontier life actually required of children, all of it was removed. Not because it did not happen. Because the America of 1932, drowning in its own economic misery, was not in the market for that version of the frontier. It wanted a different one, and it was about to get it. So, here is the loop I want to leave open for you. In the spring of 1930, a 63-year-old woman in rural Missouri sat down with a pencil and a stack of school tablets and wrote the most honest account of frontier life she could manage. She wrote about the dead baby brother. She wrote about the government relief. She wrote about Burr Oak and the kerosene and the man on fire and the neighbour who tried to hurt her. She wrote about her father's failures and her family's poverty and the 100 different ways the frontier ground people down, before it occasionally partially, not quite enough, rewarded them. She wrote 74,000 words of the truth. She had a daughter who was one of the most successful writers in America. She had a plan. She had hope. What she did not yet know was that the America she was trying to tell the truth to was not ready to hear it, that every publisher of any significance would turn it away. that the truth she had written with such care on those school tablets would be taken up by other hands, reshaped and softened and ideologically repackaged, and that the result would become the most beloved children's book series in American history, while those original tablets sat silent in a museum drawer for 84 years. But we are going to find out why. We go deeper into those tablets. We follow Laura through the most crucial years of her life, into the grief and the poverty and the darkness she refused to leave out, and we see for ourselves exactly what was written that was considered too honest for American eyes. Stay with me. The tablets are in your hands now. 400 pages, 74,000 words, written in pencil on the lined paper of ordinary school tablets bought at an ordinary general store in Mansfield, Missouri. The pencil marks are soft. In places they are almost faint. The handwriting is the handwriting of a woman in her 60s who has been writing all her life, but never quite like this. Never with quite this specific quality of permission. The permission you give yourself when you have decided, perhaps for the first time, that you're going to tell the truth to the end of the sentence and not soften the landing. You open to the first page, and Laura Ingalls Wilder takes you back to a year when she was 2 years old. A piece of Indian territory that the United States government was in the process of calling Kansas. A stretch of prairie so vast it did not seem to have edges, and a family that had moved onto land that did not belong to them. You need to sit with that for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything. The Homestead Act of 1862 was built on a fiction. It called the land of the American West empty, available, free for the taking to any white settler willing to improve it for 5 years. Free land. The mythology of the frontier runs on that phrase like a river runs on rain. The idea that the West was a blank space waiting to be written on. It was not empty. It had never been empty. The Osage Nation had lived on the land in southeastern Kansas for generations. In 1869, when Charles Ingalls loaded his family into a covered wagon and drove them southwest from Wisconsin toward the territory he had decided would be their new home, the Osage was still there. They had not yet been removed. The government treaty negotiations that would eventually force them south into Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma were still ongoing. The land was disputed. The legal status was unclear, and Charles Ingalls settled on it anyway, building a cabin and planting crops on ground that belonged to the people he could see riding past his property, that he was not supposed to be occupying, that the government would eventually order him to leave. In the Little House on the Prairie book, the third in the series, the Ingalls family is presented as settlers on open land, the frontier stretching before them with its golden promise. The Osage are present in those pages, but they move through Laura's narration as figures of fear and fascination seen from a distance, people whose land has apparently been made available for the taking by the natural order of things. In Pioneer Girl, Laura wrote the same period with more uncomfortable honesty. She wrote about looking at Osage people with the uncomplicated prejudice of a white settler child of the 1870s. She wrote about wanting one of them, specifically wanting to take an Osage baby. She described the Osage in terms that reflect the racial attitudes of her era and her upbringing, language that is jarring to read today because it is the language of a child who absorbed the worldview of people who believed, without examining the belief, that the land was theirs to take and the people already on it were obstacles rather than residents. This is not a comfortable passage. It was never meant to be a comfortable passage. And Laura was writing honestly about who she had been and what she had thought, and who she'd been at 2 and 3 years old in Indian Territory was a child shaped by people who had dispossessed others with a clean conscience. That passage was preserved in Pioneer Girl, and when the Little House books were written, the racism was substantially softened but not entirely removed. The famous line, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," remained in Little House on the Prairie, attributed to a neighbouring settler. It was not until much later, in publisher-driven revisions of the 1950s and beyond, that the most egregious language was softened. Rose Wilder Lane, whatever her faults, did not remove the racism. She shared the attitudes. The revision came from publishers decades later, not from the daughter who typed the manuscripts. Pioneer Girl, in this respect, is more honest than the books, not because the racism is excusable, but because at least it is documented as being what it was. Now go deeper into those tablets, past the Wisconsin years, past the Kansas territory, past the Plum Creek chapter that became the book on the banks of Plum Creek. Go past the grasshopper plagues and past Freddie's 9-month life and past the family's economic collapse in Minnesota. Go to Iowa. Go to Burr Oak. You arrive in Burr Oak in 1876, and the first thing you notice is the smell of the saloon next door. The Masters Hotel sat in the middle of Burr Oak, Iowa, a small farming town in the northeastern corner of the state, the kind of place built around necessity rather than ambition, where the buildings are close together because the people have no room to spread out and no particular reason to. William Masters ran the hotel and offered Charles Ingalls work managing it, which meant managing the full operation, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the rooms, keeping order in a building that stood directly adjacent to an establishment where frontier men went to spend money they did not have on whiskey that cost more than it was worth. Laura was 9 years old when her family moved into that hotel. She would later describe what she saw that year with the same quiet directness she used for everything in Pioneer Girl. A matter-of-fact accounting of violence and poverty and desperation that did not sensationalize and did not flinch. She wrote about the drunken fights that spilled from the saloon into the street. She wrote about the sounds that came through walls that were never thick enough. She wrote about watching what whiskey did to men who had nothing left to lose, which in a frontier farming community in the 1870s was a substantial portion of the male population. And then she wrote about the fire. The man was a neighbour. That is the first and most important detail. He was not a stranger passing through. He was someone who lived in Burr Oak, whose wife was known to the Ingalls family, whose daily life unfolded in proximity to theirs. He was also a man who drank. One evening he poured kerosene through the bedroom of the house he shared with his wife. He moved through the room with the methodical, deliberate motion of someone who has thought about this long enough that the thinking is finished, and only the action remains. He poured it systematically. He poured it everywhere. And then he dragged his wife by the hair out of the room before setting it alight. Pa intervened. That is the version Laura preserved in Pioneer Girl. Charles Ingalls, who for all his failures as a farmer was a man of genuine physical courage, intervened. The situation was managed. The wife survived. The image of a man pouring kerosene through his own bedroom while his wife screamed was not in any version of the Little House books. Not one line, not one shadow. This had happened less than a mile from where the Ingalls children slept. It is in Pioneer Girl because Laura saw it, or heard it, or knew of it, with the intimate certainty of someone who lives in a community small enough that its violence cannot be hidden. There is another scene in Pioneer Girl from the Burr Oak year that is even harder to sit with. A man set himself on fire. He was drunk. He had been drinking the kind of whiskey that cost frontier families everything and gave them nothing back. The kind that moved through a body like slow damage rather than quick pleasure. He was not in his right mind. And at some point during the night, in circumstances that Pioneer Girl describes but does not dramatize, he was engulfed in flames. Whether this was accidental or intentional, Laura did not speculate. She was 9 years old when it happened, or when she learned of it. And the child's eye account in Pioneer Girl does not attempt the psychological analysis that an adult narrator might impose. She simply recorded what happened. The man burned. He died, or survived with severe injuries. The surviving record is not precise on this point. It happened in Burr Oak. It was witnessed or known by the Ingalls family. Laura wrote it down. These are the kinds of events that do not appear in the Burr Oak chapters that were never written. Because there were no Burr Oak chapters. The entire year of the Ingalls family's life in this Iowa hotel town was omitted from the series entirely, and what was omitted with it was this texture of frontier violence. Not the romantic violence of adventure stories, not the noble violence of settlers defending their homes from wilderness, but the ordinary, grinding, whiskey-saturated violence of people living too close together with too little money and too many disasters behind them, and no clear way forward. That violence was the frontier for a very large portion of the people who lived it. Laura wrote it down. You're 9 years old and you're about to understand something that your parents will never directly explain to you, but that your body understands before your mind does. There is a couple in Burr Oak. They are childless. They have a comfortable home by the standards of the community, which is to say they have a home that is theirs, and they have no children to fill it. They have noticed the Ingalls family's difficulty. They have noticed that Charles and Caroline Ingalls have more children than they have resources, that the hotel work is precarious, that the family is visibly struggling in ways that even a 9-year-old can see are serious. They offer to take Laura, not a temporary arrangement, not a visit. They offer to take her as their own, to bring her into their household permanently. In Pioneer Girl, Laura understood this for what it was, not adoption in the warm, emotional sense, but acquisition. The kind of arrangement that put a child to work in someone else's household under the guise of giving her a better life. The kind of transaction that happened with uncomfortable regularity in frontier communities, where the economics of survival sometimes involved children as labour. Laura refused. More precisely, she fought it so fiercely with the particular determined fury of a child who has grasped the full meaning of what is being proposed that her parents ultimately did not pursue the arrangement. This page exists in Pioneer Girl. It was removed from the series entirely, not softened, not reframed, not transformed into something more palatable. Removed. The 9-year-old girl, who understood that she was being offered as a domestic servant, and who had the spine to resist it, disappears from the record, replaced by the cheerful, adventurous Laura of the books who was never in this particular kind of danger. The danger was real. The child who faced it was real. And the pages she wrote about it 50-some years later, in pencil on lined school tablets in a Missouri farmhouse, are as real as anything she ever put into print. There is another kind of darkness in Pioneer Girl that's quieter but no less significant. Mary Ingalls, Laura's older sister, went blind in the autumn of 1879 from a severe illness, a high fever that damaged her optic nerves. She was 13 years old. She would remain blind for the rest of her long life, dying in 1928 at 63 years old. In the Little House books, Mary's blindness is handled with the particular gentleness that the series brings to all difficult things. It is sad, and it is accepted, and Mary becomes a figure of patient endurance, attending the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa, learning Braille, developing her other senses, becoming, in the book's telling, a kind of quiet triumph of the human spirit. In Pioneer Girl, the picture is more complicated. Laura documented the psychological weight that blindness placed on Mary, the anger, the bitterness, the grief of a 13-year-old girl whose world had been taken from her before she had fully inhabited it. The adjustment was not graceful. It was not serene. It was the work of years, and in the years before it became work rather than catastrophe. It was simply catastrophe. Mary raged at what had happened to her. She mourned. She was not, in those first years, the patient and accepting figure the books would later construct. That emotional complexity is in Pioneer Girl. That portrait of a young woman fighting against the darkness of her situation, not accepting it with spiritual grace, but battling it with the full force of a personality that the blindness had not extinguished. That is in the manuscript. In the books, it was softened into something easier to look at. Here is what you need to understand about Laura Ingalls Wilder's writing voice in Pioneer Girl, because it is one of the most important things about the document. She does not tell you how to feel about what you are reading. She does not editorialize. She does not assign moral weight. She does not pause the narrative to reflect on how shocking this is, how sad, how terrible, how brave. She simply records, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. The tone is so steady, so completely devoid of drama, that the effect is almost dizzying. Last year you read about the kerosene and the fire and the man who burned and the child who understood she was being offered as labour, and none of it is narrated as extraordinary. All of it is narrated as ordinary, as the texture of a life, and that is precisely what makes it so devastating. Because the message of that steady, undramatic voice is not look at how terrible these things were. The message is, this was Tuesday, this was the frontier. This was the reality that 7 out of 10 settlers lived, that happened in ordinary communities in ordinary years, that left ordinary marks on ordinary families. Not exceptional suffering, not heroic endurance, just life narrated at its actual temperature. No wonder editors put those pages down and walked away. It wasn't just that the content was dark, it was that the darkness was presented as normal. And a Depression-era American public that needed the frontier to be something it could be proud of was not in a position to accept normal. On May 7th, 1930, Laura handed the manuscript to Rose at Rocky Ridge Farm. Rose Wilder Lane was 43 years old. She had spent the previous 2 decades covering wars, interviewing heads of state, writing for some of the most prominent magazines in America, publishing novels of her own. She was, by any professional measure, a serious and accomplished writer. She had New York connections. She understood the publishing industry from the inside. She also had a specific worldview about what the American story was supposed to mean. A worldview she held with a conviction so absolute and so political that it was less an opinion than a foundation. She believed in individual self-reliance with the fervour of someone who had built her identity on it. She believed that the story of the American frontier was a story of people who had made it on their own, through their own efforts, through the particular stubborn American refusal to accept that external forces, government, circumstance, luck, could determine a person's fate. She was, in political terms that would not be widely used for another decade, a libertarian. One of the most passionate and committed libertarians in America, and now she was holding 400 pages that documented, in quiet and meticulous detail, precisely the opposite of everything she believed. She sat down and she read, page after page after page, the Osage Territory, the Grasshopper Plague, the Government Relief Declaration, the destitute document that Pa had signed, Burr Oak, the saloon, the kerosene, the man on fire, the couple who had tried to take her mother as a servant, the dead baby brother whose name was never said aloud again, the poverty, the failure, the accumulated weight of a pioneer family that had not made it on its own, had required relief, had needed help, had depended on luck and other people, and the particular charity of a system that was supposed to not exist in the mythology Rose was trying to build. Rose read to the last page. She put the manuscript down, and she picked up her pen. What she did next is what the next chapter is about. What she crossed out. What she rewrote. What she transformed, when in the most consequential act of literary revision in American publishing history, from the raw, uncomfortable truth into something a nation was willing to believe about itself. But I want you to hold one thought before we get there. Laura gave her those pages. She handed them over willingly. She knew who Rose was. She knew what Rose believed. And she handed her daughter the most honest document she had ever created and waited to see what would come back. What came back was not what she wrote, but she needed it to be what it became, and that bargain between truth and survival, between what was real and what the world was willing to accept, is going to tell you something about both of those women that nothing else can. Rose Wilder Lane was not the kind of woman who edited manuscripts quietly. By the time Laura placed those school tablets in her hands in the spring of 1930, Rose had been to Albania. She had interviewed Herbert Hoover. She had covered the aftermath of World War I from the field for the American Red Cross. She had published novels. She had written for the Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal and the San Francisco Bulletin. She was, by any professional measure, one of the most widely read women writers in America, the kind of writer whose byline moved magazines off newsstands in the 1920s, the way a good storm moves weather. She had also, in the years between her roving international career and the depression that flattened it, arrived at a set of political convictions so absolute and so personally forged that they had become less a worldview than a skeleton. She believed that individual human freedom was the highest value a civilization could hold. She believed that government interference in private life was, at its root, a form of coercion, however benevolent its intentions. She believed that the American frontier was the greatest proof ever offered that a human being, with nothing but their own will and their own work, could build a life from nothing. She believed this with the fervour of someone who had decided it was true before she had the language to say why, and now she was holding a manuscript that documented, in meticulous and unsparing detail, why it wasn't entirely true. To understand what Rose did to those tablets, You first need to understand what Rose had done to her own life story. She was born December the 5th, 1886, on the Dakota Tree claim where her parents were trying to build a farm from grassland and borrowed credit. She grew up at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, in conditions that were, for most of her childhood, genuinely precarious. Her parents were not prosperous. Money moved through that household the way water moves through cracked clay, not enough of it, and always threatening to run out. Rose had left Mansfield as soon as she could manage it. She became a telegrapher, then a journalist, then a traveller, then an internationally published author. She reinvented herself so completely that the girl who had grown up on a rocky Missouri hillside became a woman who filed dispatches from post-war Europe with the brisk authority of someone who had seen the worst of the world and had developed firm opinions about what produced it. What produced it, our Rose had concluded, was collectivism, government control, the surrender of individual will to institutional power. She had watched the Russian Revolution from close enough proximity to develop a visceral, bone-deep opposition to anything that resembled centralized authority over a human life. She came home from Europe in the 1920s increasingly convinced that America's unique genius was its tradition of radical individual liberty, and increasingly alarmed that the Depression was being used to justify a government expansion that would corrode that tradition past the point of recovery. By 1930, Rose Wilder Lane was well on her way to becoming one of the founding figures of American libertarianism. She would eventually be identified, alongside Ayn Rand and Albert J. Nock, as one of the intellectual architects of the modern American right. Her 1943 book, The Discovery of Freedom, would become a foundational libertarian text. But in the summer of 1930, she was 43 years old and reading her mother's handwriting in pencil, and on every page she was finding evidence that contradicted the faith she had built her identity on. Rose did not sit passively with those tablets. That was never her way. She read the manuscript through, then rolled a fresh sheet of paper into her typewriter and began producing what scholars now call the Brant text, the first of 3 major typescript revisions she would create between 1930 and 1932. Each version moved further from Laura's handwritten original. Each one crossed out more, added more of Rose's own prose, restructured more of the narrative architecture. The Brant text was the first and, in some ways, most revealing pass. It shows what Rose reached for immediately when she sat down to make Pioneer Girl publishable. The kerosene fire scene was removed. The self-immolation was removed. The attempted assault on young Laura in Burr Oak was removed. The attempted acquisition of Laura as an unpaid household servant was removed. The specific texture of the alcoholic violence that spilled from the saloon into the street where the Ingalls children lived, gone. These removals are not surprising. They are precisely the content that commercial editors and agents would flag immediately as unmarketable for a general adult audience in Depression-era America. An editorial eye trained by New York Publishing would identify them in a first pass. But there is a second category of removal in the Brant text that is less obvious and far more consequential. It is not the violence that we need to examine here. It is the government. In the Pioneer Girl manuscript, Laura had written about the Grasshopper Plague years with the same quiet matter-of-factness she brought to everything. The Rocky Mountain locusts had come in 1874. They had returned in 1875 and 1876. The sky had turned brown with them, a moving, rasping mass that descended on crops and ate them to the roots, that consumed wooden tool handles because those handles had been touched by salt-sweated human hands, that could strip a field to bare earth in an afternoon. The Ingalls family had survived those years in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, in part because state and local governments had organized relief programs. Minnesota had appropriated funds for the poorest affected families. Local relief committees had distributed aid. And Charles Ingalls, Pa, the hero, the fiddler, the man who had become one of the most beloved father figures in American children's literature, had accepted that aid. He had gone to the relief office and signed a document declaring his family destitute. That word, destitute, not struggling, not experiencing a temporary setback, destitute, the language of official government relief, the language of the public record, the language that meant this family cannot feed itself without outside assistance. Laura had written this down in Pioneer Girl without emphasis and without shame. It was a fact. It had happened. She recorded it the way she recorded the colour of the grass and the sound of the wind, as part of the landscape of a life that had been what it had been. Rose removed it. Not gently reframed. Not softened into something more palatable. Removed. The relief programs vanished from the typescript. The destitute declaration was cut from the record as cleanly as if it had never been made. What remained was Pa's resilience, Pa's determination, Pa's refusal to give up on the land. What did not remain was Pa accepting any help from any source he had not personally earned. This was not an editorial decision. It was an ideological one, and it was the decision that would shape the Little House book's relationship to historical truth for the next 8 decades. There were other passages in Pioneer Girl that Rose had to manage, and they were not all dark in the way of poverty and violence. Some were dark in the way of moral complication. Laura had written about the bloody Benders, the Kansas family of serial killers who had operated an inn along the Osage Trail in the early 1870s, murdering travellers for their belongings and burying the bodies in an orchard behind their property. The Benders, John, Elvira, their son John Jr. and their daughter Kate, had been in the same region where the Ingalls family lived during their Kansas period. In Pioneer Girl, Laura wrote that Pa had been part of the posse that pursued the Benders when they fled. Historians who have cross-referenced the documented timelines, including Pioneer Girl editor Pamela Smith Hill, have found this claim unlikely. The dates don't align with Charles Ingalls' known whereabouts, and the story may have been frontier legend absorbed into family memory over years of retelling rather than something Pa actually did. But Laura wrote it as memory, and it was in those tablets. And Rose also found, woven through Laura's account of the Dakota Territory communities where she'd grown up, references to the love triangles and romantic entanglements of small frontier towns, the adult social world of people living in close proximity with scarce options and limited privacy. Laura had documented these situations with her characteristic plainness. They were part of the texture of a real community. They were entirely inappropriate for a children's book, and at minimum complicated for a commercial adult memoir. All of it required management. Rose managed it. She was a professional. What she produced from those passes was cleaner, more linear, more appropriate for a commercial readership. It was also, in the process, less true. And the cumulative weight of those subtractions, the violence, the government relief, the adult complexity, the economic failure, was producing something that bore less and less resemblance to the document Laura had handed over in May of 1930. In the summer and autumn of 1930, Rose sent the Brandt text to literary agent Carl Brandt in New York. Brandt was a reputable agent with solid publishing connections. He circulated the manuscript. He had the tools, the access, and the professional relationships to put a manuscript in front of the right eyes. The right eyes read it. And the right eyes said no. The rejections came back with a consistent theme. The manuscript was too episodic. It lacked a dramatic arc. It moved chronologically from one event to the next without the shape that readers expected from a memoir, without the rising tension and the crescendo and the resolution that gave a narrative the feeling of having travelled somewhere. Laura's matter-of-fact voice, which was the truest and most remarkable quality of Pioneer Girl, read to commercial publishers as flatness. Her refusal to assign dramatic weight to any single event, her treatment of the grasshopper sky and the neighbour's fire and the destitute declaration, all in the same quiet, undramatic register, was precisely what made Pioneer Girl a significant historical document and precisely what made it difficult to sell to a 1930s market hungry for warmth and escape. Brandt returned the manuscript. More work was needed, he said, more shaping, or more emotional stakes. Rose sat down at her typewriter again. By 1931, Carl Brandt had been replaced by a second literary agent, George By. By was equally well connected, and if anything, more aggressive in pursuing magazine serialization, which was still the primary target. The Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal were the publications Rose and Laura had aimed for from the beginning. Both had enormous circulations and paid handsomely for serialized content. A deal with either would have transformed the women's financial situation entirely. By submitted what scholars now call the By text, the third and most heavily revised of Rose's typescript versions, progressively more polished and more distant from Laura's penciled original. The magazine said no, and By, in his response to Rose, said something that became one of the most quoted lines in all of Wilder scholarship. He wrote that Pioneer Girl had not warmed him enough at first reading, that it didn't seem to have enough high points or crescendo, that it read, he said, like a fine old lady sitting in a rocking chair and telling the story chronologically, but with no benefit of perspective or theatre. A fine old lady in a rocking chair. That phrase has sat in the archive for nearly a century. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was 63 when she wrote Pioneer Girl. She had watched a man burn. She had fought off an attempted assault at 9 years old. She had buried a brother whose name was never spoken again. She possessed a prose voice that was controlled, deliberate, and in its very restraint one of the most powerful American documentary instruments of the early 20th century. George By called it a rocking chair. What he meant, stripped of the condescension, was that the manuscript lacked the theatrical architecture that Depression-era audiences expected from memoir. He was not entirely wrong about the structural problem, but his language suggests he had substantially missed the point of the thing he was reading. There is a September afternoon in 1931, and Rose Wilder Lane opens her diary. She writes, feeling dull and sunk. That entry, 3 words, dated September 11th, 1931, is one of the most humanising moments in the entire Pioneer Girl story. Rose, who was capable of crafting sentences with surgical precision, reduced herself to 3 words because 3 words were all she had for it. Dull and sunk. The feeling of someone who has been pushing against a door that will not open for so long that the pushing no longer feels like effort. It just feels like the wall. Elsewhere in those 1930 to 1932 diaries she wrote, working on my mother's story. Stupidly. For will it come to anything? The word stupidly is almost unbearable. It is the word of a professional writer who knows better than to keep revising something the market has already rejected 3 times over. The word of a daughter who cannot put the manuscript down, cannot walk away from her mother's 63 years of life written in pencil on lined paper, cannot accept that no one will publish it. For will it come to anything? She kept working. That same year, the Country Home magazine sent back its own polite refusal. The language was careful. Pioneer Girl contained some very interesting pioneer reminiscences, but the magazine has no place for non-fiction serials. Very interesting. The institutional phrase for not for us. The Depression-era publishing industry had contracted its appetite for adult memoir. Alongside everything else it could no longer afford. There was no market, and there was no making one. And then came Knopf. Alfred A. Knopf was among the most prestigious publishers in America. To have a manuscript circulating at Knopf was already a different category of conversation than anything that had come before. Knopf published serious literary work. They assessed manuscripts on aesthetic merit rather than purely commercial calculation. For a brief genuine moment in late 1931, Laura Ingalls Wilder's autobiography was being seriously considered by one of the great American literary publishers of the century. Interest had been expressed. Not a contract, but active, specific, unmistakable interest. And then Knopf shut down their children's publishing division. Not the whole house, just the imprint where Pioneer Girl had been positioned. The Depression was doing to publishers what it was doing to everyone, forcing choices about what could survive and what had to be cut. The children's imprint was cut. The conversation ended. The interest expired before it could become a deal. Rose and Laura received that news at Rocky Ridge Farm and had nothing left to say to it. 2 years, 3 typescript revisions, 2 literary agents, multiple publishers, magazines, and nothing. The original, as Laura had written it, was not going to find a home. The manuscript that told the truth about what the frontier had actually been was going to remain in the tablets, unpublished, while the women who needed the money it might have earned watched the Depression deepen around them. Rose sat with that reality for a long time, and then she had an idea that no one had tried yet. Before we get to the idea, there is a letter Rose had written to Laura 5 years earlier, in 1925. when a smaller collaboration between them had produced a saleable magazine piece. The piece had worked. An editor had bought it, and Rose had written to her mother to explain precisely why it had sold. "You must understand," Rose wrote, "that what sold was your article, edited. You must study how it was edited and why. Above all, you must listen to me. Above all, you must listen to me." Those 6 words are the key to the entire collaboration that produced the Little House books. Not because they are cruel. They are not cruel. They are the blunt professional directive of a daughter who understood the publishing world and was trying to help her mother succeed inside it. But they reveal, with complete clarity, the power structure of everything that followed. Rose was not an equal partner. Rose was the expert. Laura was the raw material, and the job of the raw material was to listen. By 1931, that dynamic had calcified into something deeper. Rose was not just editing. She was, as she freely admitted in her letters, adding what she called pure sensory effect, details of sight and sound and texture that were not in Laura's original, that Rose generated to give the prose the warmth and immediacy the market required. She was constructing a building over Laura's foundation. The foundation was still there, but it was becoming harder to see. In late 1931, Rose did something that had not yet been tried. She took the Wisconsin section of Pioneer Girl, Laura's earliest memories, the big woods years before the family began its long, losing migration across the frontier, and she distilled it into a 21-page manuscript she titled When Grandma Was a Little Girl. She changed the narrative voice from first person to third, changed I to Laura, stripped out the adult memoir structure entirely, and reframed the material as fiction for children, warm, episodic. Tender stories told from inside the experience of a small girl in a log cabin in the Wisconsin woods, where Pa played fiddle after supper, and the bears stayed at the edge of the lamplight, and the world felt safe inside those 4 log walls. The Wisconsin years were comparatively the most benign of Laura's childhood. The violence and the hotel and the destitute declaration and the Burr Oak Saloon were all years later. In 1869, Wisconsin. The family had not yet encountered the full weight of what the frontier would demand. That section of Pioneer Girl was the one section that could, with enough revision, be shaped into the story Rose had always believed the frontier was supposed to tell. She sent it out. The 21 pages circulated to New York publishers, and one afternoon in late 1931, an editor at Harper & Brothers read those pages, and instead of a rejection letter, he sent back a request. He wanted it, not as a picture book, but as a novel. He wanted 15,000 more words. He wanted the full children's book, built from this material, this voice, this little girl in the big woods with her father's music and the deep, safe, howling dark outside. It was the first door that had opened in 2 years. Laura sat down at her desk at Rocky Ridge Farm, 64 years old and 2 years past her first hope, and almost past her second. She opened the school tablets to the Wisconsin section. She picked up her pencil, and she began, for the first time since May of 1930, to write with the knowledge that someone on the other end of the mail was waiting. But what she wrote this time was not what she had written before. The shape of it was different. The frame was different. The darkness had been removed before she began because the darkness was why the adult version had failed, and she was not going to let it fail again. She was writing for children now. She was writing warm. She was writing safe. The original tablets sat on the desk. The Burr Oak Saloon was still there. The man who burned was still there. The destitute declaration was still there. The dead baby brother whose name was never said aloud was still there. She did not open to those pages. What went to Harper & Brothers in the spring of 1932 was Little House in the Big Woods. It was published on April 6, 1932. It received enthusiastic reviews. It sold through its first printing despite the Depression. Harper Brothers requested a sequel, and the publishing house asked, "What happens next? What was the next part of your childhood? We want the rest of the story." They had said yes to the myth, to the version without the government relief and the dead brother and the saloon and the violence, and the 55% of the original manuscript that was now sitting silent in the tablets. And they wanted 7 more books. What Laura and Rose were now required to build, across 11 years and 8 volumes, was a complete pioneer mythology constructed from the bones of a life that had been almost the opposite of what that mythology described. Book by book, decision by decision, erasure by erasure. The most consequential mother-daughter collaboration in American literary history had not yet produced its most consequential work. It was just getting started. Harper and Brothers wanted 15,000 more words. That sentence, which should have felt like a triumph, landed in Rocky Ridge Farm like a different kind of weight entirely. Because those 15,000 words had to come from somewhere. They had to come from the tablets, from the same handwritten pages that every publisher in New York had spent 2 years declining. And this time, when Laura opened those pages to extract what Harper wanted, she could not bring everything she found there. She had to choose. That choice, made deliberately, practically, and at 64 years old with the full knowledge of what it would require, is the act that turned Laura Ingalls Wilder from a rejected memoirist into one of the most beloved American authors of the 20th century. It is also the act that buried the truth about pioneer life for 84 years. The magic trick was about to begin. And like all the best magic tricks, it worked precisely because neither the audience nor, eventually the performer could fully see the mechanics of what had been hidden. The first mechanical shift was also the most deceptively simple, the pronoun. In Pioneer Girl, Laura wrote in first person. I saw, I heard, I was afraid. It was the voice of a woman in her 60s, looking back at 60 years of accumulated memory, speaking from inside her own experience with the quiet authority of someone who had been there and was still, in some ways, there. The first-person voice was Laura's most powerful literary tool. It was also, as 2 years of rejections had demonstrated, commercially unpublishable. In the children's version that became Little House in the Big Woods, the voice shifted. Laura saw. Laura heard. Laura was afraid. A single change in pronoun, from the interior I to the external Laura, performed a transformation so complete that it is worth sitting with for a moment. The first-person memoir is a confession. It is an adult speaking directly into your ear, claiming accountability for everything it says. The third-person Laura, by contrast, is a character, a figure in a story, someone you observe from a safe and comfortable distance, someone whose world can be arranged for your pleasure, someone whose darkest memories can be quietly set aside because the storyteller, standing outside the experience, has decided they don't belong here. That distance was not incidental. It was structural. It was the space Rose needed to do her work, because once Laura became a character rather than a narrator, the story was no longer autobiography, it was fiction. And fiction, unlike memoir, does not owe its readers the truth. It owes them only a satisfying experience. The experience Rose and Laura were building was warmth, lamplight, fiddle music at the end of a hard day, a father who was larger than life and a mother who was steady as bedrock, and a little girl who faced the vast wild world from inside the circle of a family that would never break. That was the story Harper Brothers wanted. That was the story Depression-era America needed. And it bore only partial resemblance to the tablets on the desk. Of all the transformations in the Little House series, the transformation of Charles Philip Ingalls is the most historically consequential and the most personally revealing. In Pioneer Girl, Charles Ingalls appears as a complete human being. He is charming and musical and capable of physical feats that his daughters genuinely admired. He is also restless in a way that constitutes a pattern of economic failure. The historical record confirms what Laura's memoir documented plainly. Charles Ingalls moved 17 times in 30 years. He abandoned claim after claim, farm after farm. He accepted government relief during the grasshopper plague years. He signed a document declaring his family destitute. He made decisions that kept his family circling the frontier in a state of perpetual near-destitution for decades, never quite achieving the stability that his peripatetic optimism always insisted was just over the next horizon. Laura wrote all of this down, not as a condemnation. She loved her father, and the love is present on every page. but as plain documentary fact. The man was who he was. He played the fiddle and he couldn't stay put, and sometimes the family had enough to eat and sometimes they didn't, and that was the life. In the Little House books, Charles Ingalls was remade. His constant moving became adventure. His restlessness became courage. His inability to establish a lasting farm became the heroic spirit of a true pioneer, always drawn westward by the call of open land, the unbroken sky, the freedom that only the frontier could offer. The destitute declaration was gone. The government relief was gone. The pattern of failure was gone. What remained was the fiddle music and the tall silhouette in the doorway, and the man who called his family close on winter evenings and told them that as long as they were together, they were home. That Pa, the Pa of the Little House books, became one of the most beloved fictional fathers in American literature. He was warm and funny and capable and present in the way that fathers in children's books are permitted to be present, without the complexity and the failure and the economic desperation that make actual fathers human. He was an ideal. He was in many ways what Rose had decided the American pioneer man should have been. He was also, by the standards of verifiable historical record, a character rather than a biography. Between April of 1932 and the spring of 1943, Neusaster, Harper Brothers published 8 Little House books. They arrived at roughly 2-year intervals, each one extending the story forward in time, from the Wisconsin Big Woods, through the Kansas Indian Territory, through the Minnesota Grasshopper years, through Burr Oak. No, wait, not through Burr Oak. That year was gone. The Burr Oak period, the hotel, the saloon next door, the year the Ingalls family spent at the lowest point of their economic lives, does not appear in the Little House series. Not in altered form, not softened or reframed for young readers, simply not present. The family story jumps from Minnesota to Silver Lake, Dakota Territory, with the Iowa years invisible, as if the family had simply skipped that chapter of their lives and continued west. In a way they had. That was what the magic trick required. Not just softening what was dark, but removing it entirely, so cleanly that a reader who had never encountered Pioneer Girl would not sense an absence. There is no crater where Burr Oak used to be. There is just a seamless narrative that moves from one frontier location to the next, and the space where an entire year of poverty and exposure and near assault of a young girl once lived is now simply a gap between chapters that no one was supposed to notice. Freddie was not present. The brother who lived 9 months during the grasshopper plague years and died while the family was already struggling, he does not appear anywhere in the 8 books. The Ingalls family in the Little House series has 4 daughters and no son. That is the presented fact. The grave in South Troy, Minnesota, existed in Pioneer Girl and in the historical record. It did not exist in the books that 60 million readers would eventually hold. What the 8 books did build, across more than a decade of work, was a complete and self-consistent mythology. It had an internal architecture as deliberate and load-bearing as any structure designed by an engineer. Each book advanced the family chronologically, deepened the reader's investment in Laura and Mary and Ma and Pa, and reinforced again and again, the central thesis that had shaped the project from the moment Rose sat down at her typewriter, that pioneer families survive through their own individual resourcefulness, their own determination, their own refusal to depend on anything outside themselves. That thesis was historically false, but it was ideologically perfect. The year Little House in the Big Woods appeared on shelves was 1932. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to the presidency that same November. The New Deal, the most ambitious expansion of federal government in American history to that point, the system of relief programs and public works and institutional support that would define government's relationship to struggling Americans for generations, was beginning to take shape. Rose Wilder Lane was watching this with horror. She believed, with the conviction of someone who had constructed her entire intellectual identity around the proposition, that what FDR was building would destroy America's essential character, that the relief programs, the government employment initiatives, the federal safety nets being woven across an economy in catastrophic freefall, all of it was the first step toward the collectivism she had watched consume Europe. She wrote about this. She published about this. She argued about this in letters to everyone she knew, and she kept editing her mother's books. What the Little House series offered, in the cultural context of the 1930s and 1940s, was a counter-argument to the New Deal made in the most effective medium imaginable. Children's stories, not policy papers, not political essays, stories about a little girl in a sunbonnet whose father never accepted government help, whose family never needed a relief program, whose survival through locusts and blizzards and crop failures was the product of personal virtue and family unity and the particular American genius for making something from nothing. Pa never signed a destitute declaration in those books. He just played the fiddle a little harder and worked a little longer and moved on to the next horizon when the current one failed. Because that was what Americans did. Because that was what Americans had always done. Because dependence on government was not the American way. And Laura's family, the most famous pioneer family in the country, proved it. The books were published between 1932 and 1943, exactly spanning the New Deal era. They were not in any direct and provable way a coordinated political project, but Rose's fingerprints were on every page of them, and Rose's political convictions had a shape that, once you see it, you cannot unsee in the series she spent a decade building from her mother's life. By 1939, Laura and Rose had been collaborating for 9 years. 7 books had been published. The 8th, By the Shores of Silver Lake, was in draft, covering the period when the family first arrived in Dakota Territory and the years that would bridge Laura's childhood to her adolescence. Rose read the draft, and then she wrote her mother a letter. The letter is preserved in the archive. In it, Rose critiques the draft's handling of a subplot involving frontier romantic and sexual dynamics, the adult social world of a Dakota Territory community in the 1880s, where young men and young women navigated attraction in the close quarters of a small prairie town. Laura had included elements of this world in her draft the way she included everything, matter-of-factly, without drama, because it had been part of the texture of her actual adolescence. Rose objected. She argued that the kind of social complexity Laura was describing, the adult romantic entanglement and sexual awareness that characterized frontier community life, was the kind of thing that, in her words, typically belonged in the cities rather than on the frontier. The implication was that the pioneer communities of the 1870s and 1880s were simpler, purer, more morally straightforward than Laura's draft suggested. This argument has a specific name in the scholarship. It is called idealization. And it was, by 1939, one of the oldest arguments in the collaboration. But this time, Laura pushed back. The letters that follow suggest a significant friction point, the kind that doesn't resolve cleanly and doesn't leave both participants unchanged. Laura was 69 years old and had spent nearly a decade yielding her material to Rose's professional judgment, her memories reshaped and her voice adjusted, and her darkest experiences excised from the record. She had accepted it. She had accepted it because the books were selling, and the royalties were coming in, and both women needed the money. But by 1939, she had also been watching her own memories transformed into someone else's version of her childhood for long enough that the transformation had started to feel like something other than collaboration. She revised the Silver Lake draft. It was published in 1939. The adult complexity was softened. The frontier remained pure. Laura kept going. And the thing she was keeping inside her during the keep going, whatever it was, she did not write down in any letter that has survived. Somewhere in the middle years of the collaboration, Rose Wilder Lane moved to Connecticut. The practical details matter here. She was 1,000 miles from Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. She was continuing to edit her mother's manuscripts. The process of collaboration had, by necessity, shifted entirely to the postal service. Laura would mail a draft. Rose would revise and type and mail back. Laura would review the typescript and mail her reactions. Rose would revise again. For a collaboration this intensive and this contested, this was an extraordinary distance to maintain. There are multiple interpretations of the move. Rose needed space, professionally and personally. Her own writing career had stalled during the years of editing, and she felt the cost of it. Her political writing was accelerating, the discovery of freedom was coming, and she could not do that work effectively while simultaneously functioning as her mother's on-site editor and typist. She had a life of her own that the collaboration was consuming. She also, and this is documented in the diaries and letters, had a relationship with her mother that was charged with the particular voltage of two strong-willed women who had been circling each other for decades across an unequal power dynamic. Rose had professional authority. Laura had moral authority. The collaboration required them to constantly negotiate whose authority governed which decisions. That negotiation, stretched across a decade and 8 books, had worn both women down in ways that the surviving letters make visible even when the letters themselves are careful. The distance was, among other things, a pressure valve. But it meant that the editorial work continued to happen even more thoroughly through the mail, where Rose's revisions arrived in typescript form, already transformed, already the thing that Harper Brothers would eventually print. And Laura would review them from a position of accumulated exhaustion and accumulated gratitude, and something that, in later years, scholars would describe with the careful word ambivalence. In 1993, a scholar named William Holtz published a book called The Ghost in the Little House. It was the first major work to document with manuscript-level evidence the extent to which Rose Wilder Lane's contribution to the Little House series went beyond professional editing into something that deserved a different word entirely. Holtz compared Laura's handwritten drafts to Rose's typescripts to the published books. The gap between what Laura wrote and what appeared on the page was, in many instances, significant enough to raise a question that the entire Wilder legacy had been structured to prevent. Who, exactly, wrote these books? The traditional answer, the answer on every cover, every library card, every school reading list, was Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in the sense that the memories were Laura's, the events were Laura's, the emotional core of the stories was Laura's, that answer is not wrong. But the prose that millions of readers fell in love with, the shaped, paced, warm, dramatically structured narrative prose that made the books feel like living experience, that prose had Rose's hands all over it, not just lightly, substantially. In some sections, the comparison between Laura's handwritten draft and the published page reveals a transformation so complete that editing becomes an inadequate word for what happened. The current scholarly consensus, built from decades of manuscript analysis and correspondence research, is that both women contributed essentially. Laura's memories and narrative events, Rose's professional construction and ideological framing, but that the collaboration was profoundly unequal in one direction. Rose received no public credit. Her name appears nowhere on any of the 8 books. Her extraordinary labour across more than a decade of intensive creative work was rendered invisible, at her own insistence and at the publishing industry's complete indifference. Laura knew this. She was not unaware of the arrangement. She had entered into it with open eyes because the alternative, no publication, no royalties, no literary recognition at 64 years old, was worse. But the knowledge of it, and the years of watching her memories become someone else's construction, had a cost that she carried quietly, and that occasionally surfaced in her letters as what scholars have described, carefully and precisely, as the feeling of being usurped. The royalties began arriving with Little House in the Big Woods in 1932, and they kept arriving. Book by book, year by year, the women's financial situation stabilized and then improved. By the late 1930s, Laura Ingalls Wilder was a name that meant something in American children's literature. By the 1940s, it meant a great deal. Fan letters arrived at Rocky Ridge Farm from children across the country. Children who had grown up with these books, who had handed them to their younger siblings, who had named their dogs and their imaginary friends after the characters inside. She had been 64 when the first one was published. She was 72 when the 6th appeared. She was 76 when the 8th and final book, These Happy Golden Years, covering her courtship and marriage to Almanzo, was published in 1943. 76 years old. More than a decade of publication. 8 books. And for the first time in her life, Laura Ingalls Wilder was famous. The letters came. The Newbery Honour nominations came. The invitations came. Libraries across the country named reading programs after her. In 1954, the American Library Association established the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award to honour distinguished contributions to children's literature, and they gave the inaugural award to Laura herself, because she had done the thing that children's literature is supposed to do. She had made millions of children love books, love history, love the feeling of being inside a story that felt true. She received the award at age 87. She had spent the previous decade living quietly at Rocky Ridge Farm, answering fan letters in her careful handwriting, receiving occasional visitors who wanted to see the place where America's most beloved pioneer author had lived and worked. And in a drawer somewhere at Rocky Ridge Farm, the school tablets were sitting, the pencil-written pages, the 400 pages of Pioneer Girl, the Burr Oak chapter still intact, Freddie still present, the destitute declaration still there, the self-immolation still there, the sexual threat still there. The real story, the one no one had published, the one no one was talking about, the myth had fully formed. It was in schools and libraries and the national imagination, and the hearts of children who had grown up believing that the frontier was exactly as warm and golden and self-sufficient as the books described. It was in the television conversations already beginning in Hollywood, where producers were beginning to think that these stories could be something larger than books. And underneath all of it, in the drawer, the truth was waiting. Laura Ingalls Wilder died on February 10th, 1957. She was 90 years old. She'd outlived nearly everyone who had been alive during the time the books described. Her parents, her sister Mary, her sister Carrie, most of the neighbours and townspeople and characters who had populated her childhood. She had lived long enough to see her books achieve a permanence she had not dared imagine when she handed those tablets to Rose in the spring of 1930. She did not leave instructions about Pioneer Girl. She did not arrange for its publication. Did not campaign in her final years to have the original manuscript see daylight. She had made her choice in 1932, and she had lived inside that choice for 25 years, and at the end she carried whatever she felt about it, the way she had carried everything difficult in her life, quietly, without complaint, in the space between what she said and what she wrote down. The tablets passed to the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home and Museum in Mansfield, where Rose's 3 typescript revisions were archived at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. The official story of Laura Ingalls Wilder remained exactly as the 8 books had presented it. A heroic family, a noble father, a self-reliant journey across the American frontier, a story of individual virtue triumphant against every difficulty the Prairie could manufacture. Nobody was talking about what was in the drawer. Rose Wilder Lane would die in 1968. The television series that would turn Little House on the Prairie into a cultural phenomenon watched by 60 million viewers. The series that would sand the books down even further, that would make Michael Landon's Prairie the definitive American television father for a decade. That series would begin in 1974, for every year between 1957 and 2014. The myth would grow larger, and the silence around the tablets would grow deeper, and the distance between what Laura had actually written and what America believed she had written would increase. 84 years. That is how long the tablets waited. And what happened when someone finally opened the drawer, and what America found inside when they did, is a story that begins with a single editor at a small press in South Dakota who decided that the truth was worth the risk. 57 years after Laura's death, a small academic press in Pierre, South Dakota, would open a box of books on a Tuesday morning in November and watch the phone begin to ring. It would not stop ringing for weeks. But we're getting ahead of the story. Between Laura Ingalls Wilder's death on February 10th, 1957, and that November morning in 2014, 57 years of silence. The tablets sat in their drawer at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. And the myth they had been transformed into grew so large and so deeply rooted in American culture that removing it would have required surgery rather than revision. The myth had become the nation's memory, and the tablets were its secret. This is about what happens when a truth waits 57 years to be told, what grows in that silence, what it costs, and what it takes, finally, impossibly, to break it. Rose Wilder Lane outlived her mother by 11 years. She was 81 years old when she died on October 30th, 1968 in Danbury, Connecticut, the same New England town she had retreated to decades earlier, more than 1,000 miles from Rocky Ridge Farm. She had kept moving until the very end. In 1965, at the age of 78, she travelled to Vietnam to cover the war as a journalist for Woman's Day magazine, a detail so characteristically Rose that it almost defies belief. While other women her age were slowing down, Rose was filing dispatches from a war zone, convinced that what was happening in Southeast Asia was the latest chapter in the story she had been writing her whole life. The story of free people resisting collectivist tyranny. She had been saying that story since the 1930s. She was still saying it at 78. She died before she could take the world trip she had been planning. Her desk was reportedly organised with the focused efficiency of someone who fully intended to return to work in the morning. She never publicly acknowledged, in any interview or published statement, the extent of her editorial contribution to the Little House series. The books bore her mother's name. Rose's name appeared nowhere. That arrangement, which had been made in the 1930s for practical and professional reasons, had calcified over decades into something that looked, by 1968, less like a publishing decision and more like an act of erasure. The woman who had typed every manuscript, restructured every narrative, added the sensory language that made the books breathe. That woman was invisible. And she died invisible, which was, in its own way, a kind of literary injustice that the 20th century was not yet ready to name. She left her papers to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. Among those papers, preserved in institutional acid-free archival folders, 3 typed manuscripts: the Brant text, the Brant revised text, the By text. All 3 versions of Pioneer Girl in Rose's typing, with Rose's revisions, showing every move she had made between Laura's handwriting and the published world. They would sit in those folders for decades. Here is the geography of the suppression, because geography matters. The original handwritten tablets, the 400 pencil-written pages Laura had composed in the spring of 1930, the manuscript in her own hand, the document closest to her actual voice. Those were held at the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home and Museum in Mansfield, Missouri, the farmhouse where she had written them, the place she had lived for 60 years. Her home, preserved after her death as a museum, became the physical custodian of the truth she had chosen not to publish. The 3-typed typescript revisions, Rose's edits, Rose's progressively altered versions, were in West Branch, Iowa, at the Presidential Library, 400 miles away. To understand what Pioneer Girl actually said and what had been done to it, you needed both locations. You needed to be able to move between Laura's hand and Rose's typewriter, tracking the decisions that had been made at each pass. But the 2 archives were governed by different institutions, different access policies, and different attitudes toward the material they held. Access to the original tablets in Mansfield was controlled with particular caution. The museum's responsibility was to protect the legacy of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the beloved author, the American icon, the woman whose name was on the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award that the American Library Association had established in her honour just 3 years before her death. That legacy was wholesome. It was warm. It was the sun bonnet and the fiddle music and the lamplight. The tablets were the opposite of all that, and the people responsible for the museum knew it. Approved scholars could request access. Some received it. The process was slow, cautious, and governed by the protective instinct that institutions develop around beloved figures. The instinct that says, what if people don't understand? What if they take it out of context? What if it damages what she built? The result was an academic conversation that had been happening in hushed tones for decades, in journal articles and conference papers and footnotes, a conversation the general reading public was almost entirely unaware of. Scholars knew Pioneer Girl existed. A small number had actually read it. The rest of America had no idea. On September 11th, 1974, the NBC television network premiered a new drama series based on the Little House books. Michael Landon, who at that point was best known for playing Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, took the role of Charles Ingalls. He also, over the course of the series, became its primary director and executive producer, which meant that his vision of who Pa was shaped the show's entire 9-year run more thoroughly than any other single creative decision. Landon's Pa wept. He hugged his daughters. He delivered speeches about love and community, and the importance of doing what was right even when it was hard. He was emotionally present in a way that the 1870s frontier did not typically allow men to be, or at least in a way that the 1870s frontier did not record, because the recording was done by people who'd been trained not to notice it. Landon's Charles Ingalls was the warmest father on American television, in a decade when American television was hungry for exactly that kind of warmth. 60 million viewers watched. Every week for 9 seasons from 1974 to 1983, the Ingalls family of Walnut Grove, Minnesota, a place that had been transposed and transformed far beyond anything the books described, was the most reliable source of emotional reassurance on the American airwaves. The show did not follow the books closely. It invented storylines, added characters, relocated the family, invented crises and resolutions that Laura had never written. It was, in the most literal sense, fiction built on memory. 3 layers of construction between the audience and any historical reality. But it worked. God, it worked. Little House on the Prairie. The television series reached audiences that the books had never touched. Families who didn't read, children too young for the novels, grandparents who hadn't picked up a children's book in 40 years. It turned Laura Ingalls Wilder from a beloved children's author into a cultural institution of the first order. Her name became synonymous not just with the books she had published, but with an entire image of American life. The sunbonnet, the prairie, the fiddle, the crying father, the family that faced everything together and always found their way through. And with every episode that aired, with every rerun that followed in syndication, with every child who grew up watching Michael Landon hold his television daughter while the prairie wind moved the tall grass behind them, the gap between the myth and the tablets grew wider. Because the audience that had learned to love this story was not learning to love Laura Ingalls Wilder. They were learning to love a construction so many layers deep that the original had become almost archaeologically inaccessible. Publishing Pioneer Girl into that cultural landscape, the landscape of 60 million television viewers who believed, at a cellular level, that this was what the frontier had been, would not have been simply a scholarly act. It would have been a confrontation, and confrontations with beloved myths are among the most commercially risky things a publishing industry can attempt. The silence held. In 1993, a professor at the University of Missouri named William Holtz published a book called The Ghost in the Little House. The title was precise. The argument was meticulous. Holtz had spent years comparing Laura's handwritten drafts to Rose's typescripts to the published books, tracking the transformations chapter by chapter, passage by passage, sentence by sentence. What he found was not a tidy editorial relationship, a professional polishing a talented amateur's work. What he found was something more substantial and more troubling, evidence that Rose Wilder Lane had, in certain sections of the Little House manuscripts, not edited her mother's prose but replaced it. That the dramatic pacing, the sensory language, the narrative architecture that made the books sing, those elements bore a relationship to Rose's own professional style that went beyond the work of a skilled editor and into the territory of an uncredited co-author. Holtz's argument was not that Laura's memories were Rose's invention. They were not. The stories were Laura's. The events were Laura's. The emotional core was Laura's. But the specific sentences, the shaped, polished, publishable sentences that millions of readers had experienced as the authentic voice of Laura Ingalls Wilder, those sentences, in a number of key passages, belonged to Rose. The Ghost in the Little House was published by the University of Missouri Press. It received serious scholarly attention. It was reviewed in academic journals. It was cited in subsequent Wilder scholarship. It changed the conversation among researchers who study the relationship between memoir and fiction, between editorial labour and authorial credit, between the name on the cover and the hands that shaped what the cover contained. The broader Wilder community, the fans, the tourism infrastructure, the educators who taught the books as authentic frontier history, the parents who had given them to their daughters the way their mothers had given them theirs, that community did not welcome Holtz's findings. The reaction was, in some quarters, sharp. Holtz was accused of overstating his case, of reducing Laura to a passive instrument of Rose's ambition, of failing to honour what the books had meant to generations of readers. Some of these criticisms had merit. The question of how much credit any editor deserves is genuinely complex, and the line between transformative editing and co-authorship is not always obvious even with manuscript evidence. But the emotional force of the reaction was not primarily scholarly. It was protective. These books were beloved. They had been part of people's childhoods, and the suggestion that the voice they had loved might not have been entirely whose they thought it was, that suggestion felt to some readers like a theft. Holtz's book raised the question. The Wilder community largely refused to answer it, and the tablets in Mansfield, which contained the most direct evidence available for evaluating Holtz's argument, remained accessible only to approved researchers with institutional credentials. The conversation stayed inside the Academy for another decade. In the early 2000s, a woman named Nancy Tistad Kaupal was sitting in an office at the South Dakota Historical Society Press in Pierre. This is South Dakota, a small regional academic publisher housed in the State Historical Society building, the kind of operation that publishes local history titles and scholarly monographs with print runs measured in the hundreds rather than the thousands. She was thinking about Pioneer Girl. The South Dakota connection to the Wilder story was real and specific. Laura had lived in Dakota Territory. Her father had been the first settler in what became De Smet, South Dakota. The Long Winter, one of the most harrowing books in the series, was set there. The Ingalls family was South Dakota history, and Pioneer Girl, the unedited, unvarnished account of what that history had actually been, was sitting in a museum in Missouri and a library in Iowa, controlled by estates and institutions that had been saying no to publication inquiries for decades. Kupel began the process of changing that. What followed was not a dramatic single act. It was a decade of incremental, patient, legally complex work. It involved negotiating with the estate of Roger McBride, the man who had been Rose Wilder Lane's adopted heir, who had inherited the Little House intellectual property from Rose's estate when he died in 1995, and whose own heirs now controlled the rights to the material that Rose had generated, including the 3 typescript revisions. It involved coordinating with the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, which held Rose's papers. It involved working with the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home and Museum in Mansfield, which held the original tablets. It involved navigating copyright law for a manuscript written in 1930 that had never been published. A legal situation with very few clean precedents. Every stakeholder had reasons to be cautious. The estates had financial interests in the Little House brand. The museums had reputational interests in the Wilder legacy. The archives had procedural interest in controlled access. And all of them had to be persuaded that publishing Pioneer Girl, the dark version, the real version, the one with Freddie and the Destitute Declaration and the Burr Oak Saloon, would not destroy what everyone had spent decades carefully maintaining. Kupal made the argument that would eventually unlock the drawer, that the scholarly edition format was the answer to every objection. Not a sensationalist commercial memoir, not a headline-grabbing dark secrets expose. A rigorously annotated scholarly edition with hundreds of footnotes cross-referencing every claim Laura made against historical records, census data, newspaper archives, death records, property documents, presenting the manuscript not as a scandal, but as a primary historical source. The format would legitimize the content. The apparatus would protect the legacy by contextualizing it. It worked. Slowly. Over years. It worked. The job of editor fell to Pamela Smith-Hill, a Wilder scholar, a novelist, and a professor who had spent her career studying the relationship between Laura's life and Laura's work. What Hill undertook over the following years was one of the most labour-intensive scholarly editing projects in recent American publishing history. The annotation she produced for Pioneer Girl number over 800. On some pages of the published edition, the footnotes occupy more space on the page than the manuscript text itself. Each annotation represents a piece of original research, a cross-reference between something Laura wrote in 1930 and whatever the documentary record said about whether it was accurate, contextually typical, or historically verifiable. Some of what Hill found confirmed Laura's account exactly. The grasshopper plagues were documented in Minnesota newspapers. The government relief records existed and matched Laura's account of the Destitute Declaration. The death of Charles Frederick Ingalls in August 1876 was recorded in official registers. Freddie had existed. He had died. He was in the historical record, waiting. Some of what Hill found complicated or contradicted Laura's account. The Bloody Bender story, the dramatic tale of Pa joining the posse pursuing the Kansas serial killers, was one of the entries that scrutiny could not confirm. The timeline of the Ingalls family's Kansas period, cross-referenced against documented records of the Bender pursuit, did not align in a way that made Charles Ingalls' participation plausible. The story was likely frontier legend, absorbed into family memory over decades of retelling and becoming, by the time Laura wrote it down in 1930, as real to her as anything she had actually witnessed. This was not a diminishment of Laura. It was a demonstration of how memory works, how the stories that circulate in a community over years become indistinguishable from experience, how the line between what you witnessed and what you were told blurs over 6 decades of human life. Laura was not lying. She was remembering in the way that human beings remember, selectively, narratively, with the emotional truth always more reliable than the factual precision. Hill documented all of this. She documented the confirmations and the complications with equal scholarly care, producing an apparatus that transformed Pioneer Girl from a rejected draft into something it had never been able to become in 1930, a serious, credible, rigorously sourced historical document. There is a specific kind of knowledge that lives in archives, knowledge that has been true for decades, that scholars have known and written about in publications with print runs of 300 copies, that has been available to anyone with the institutional credentials to request access and the professional training to understand what they were reading. The knowledge that Pioneer Girl existed and contradicted the Little House books was that kind of knowledge. Wilder scholars had been writing about the manuscript in academic journals and monographs since the 1970s. Johnny Miller's work on the Wilder legacy, Anita Claire Fellman's analysis of the political ideology embedded in the series, the careful documented scholarship that built up paper by paper, year by year, a portrait of the collaboration between Laura and Rose that was profoundly different from the public understanding. None of it reached the public, because the public was watching Michael Landon. The gap between what scholars knew and what the general public understood about Laura Ingalls Wilder was, by 2013, one of the largest such gaps in American literary history, and 60 million television viewers believed they knew who Pa was. 200 scholars knew otherwise, and the tablet in Mansfield and 400 pages of pencil handwriting, Laura's hand, Laura's voice, the truest document the frontier had produced about what the frontier had actually been, was still in its drawer. The pre-publication announcement came in November 2013. The South Dakota Historical Society Press confirmed that Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, edited by Pamela Smith Hill, would be published in November 2014. The price would be $39.95, expensive for a popular trade book, appropriate for a scholarly edition, a signal of the institutional seriousness with which the press was treating the material. The first print run was set at 15,000 copies. For the South Dakota Historical Society Press, a regional academic publisher whose previous titles rarely cracked 4-figure sales, this was an ambitious bet. It was more than the press had ever printed of a single title. It was, by the standards of academic publishing, a genuine risk. The media picked up the announcement. NPR covered it. The Smithsonian covered it. Publishers Weekly covered it. The story wrote itself. America's most beloved children's author. A rejected manuscript. 84 years of silence. A dark truth buried under the myth of the sunbonnet and the fiddle music. Pre-orders began arriving. They kept arriving. On November 17th, 2014, the boxes of Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography shipped from the press to bookstores and library distributors and individual pre-order customers across the country. The woman at the front desk of the South Dakota Historical Society Press picked up the phone for the first time that morning and did not put it down for the rest of the day. The 15,000 copies were gone within days, not weeks, days. The press that had printed them scrambled to schedule reprints. The New York Times added it to the bestseller list, a title from a small regional academic press in Pierre, South Dakota, that had never come close to anything like a bestseller before, that existed to publish South Dakota local history and scholarly monographs, that had taken an institutional gamble on the idea that the truth lore Ingalls Wilder wrote in 1930 was still worth reading in 2014. They had been right. America was ready. But being ready for a truth and knowing what to do with it are two different things. Because what Pioneer Girl revealed about Pa, about Freddie, about the Destitute Declaration, about the government relief and the saloon and the kerosene and the man who burned, all of it arrived in a culture that had spent 84 years building its understanding of the American frontier on the foundation of the books that had erased all of that. And the question that came next, the question of what you do when the myth you were raised on turns out to have been, in its kindest description, incomplete, is the hardest question this story has to offer. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. In the time it took the phones at the South Dakota Historical Society Press to ring off the hook on November 17th, 2014, the book they had printed, the 15,000-copy first run of Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography that had been pre-sold, packaged, shipped, and placed into waiting hands across the country, was already doing the thing that suppressed truths always do when they finally surface after a very long time underground. It was changing what people thought they knew, not in the way of a scandal, not in the thunderclap way of an exposé or a confession or a document leaked from behind a locked door. This was quieter than that, and in some ways more unsettling. Because what Pioneer Girl delivered to its readers in the autumn of 2014 was not a bombshell. It was simply a voice, Laura's voice, the actual one. First person, pencil on paper, matter of fact, stripped of everything that 84 years of editorial intervention had added to it. And that voice, delivered plain into the hands of a country that had built a piece of its national identity on the polished version, produced something that nobody had a clean word for. It felt like meeting someone you had known your whole life and discovering, in that meeting, that you had only ever known their photograph. What readers found when they opened Pioneer Girl was not what they expected, even those who had read the advanced descriptions and the media coverage and the scholarly summaries. They found Laura, not the Laura of the big woods, though standing with her small hands pressed against the cabin window, watching the snow fall in the dark. Not the literary character whose world had been curated for warmth and episodic pleasure and the particular dreamlike safety of a childhood told from the outside. This Laura was inside her own story, in the first person, without the frame of fiction to soften or arrange what she was describing. And the difference between those two Lauras, between the Laura of the books and the I of the tablets, was not primarily one of darkness. It was one of presence, of a woman fully inhabiting her own experience and refusing, even at age 63, looking backward across decades, to arrange her memories into something more aesthetically pleasing than the truth. The sentences were not theatrical. They did not build toward crescendos. They moved at the pace of a life actually lived. Read not a story being shaped for an audience. This happened, and then this happened. The grasshoppers came, and the crops failed, and the government relief was accepted, and they moved on, and none of it was the fault of weakness or insufficient virtue. It was the frontier, which was hard in the way that hard things are hard, specifically, repeatedly, without apology, and without the kind of narrative resolution that makes difficulty bearable in retrospect. The readers who had grown up with the books and who sat down in November 2014 to read Pioneer Girl reported a reading experience that was, in their own words, disorienting in the best possible way. Not because they were learning that the frontier had been unpleasant. The books had certainly contained difficulty, blizzards and scarlet fever, and long winters without enough food. But because the nature of the difficulty in Pioneer Girl was different in kind from the difficulty in the books. In the books, difficulty arrived and was overcome, and the family was stronger for it. In Pioneer Girl, difficulty arrived and was survived, which is not the same thing. The survival left marks. The marks did not resolve into lessons. That distinction between overcoming and surviving is the essential difference between the myth and the document, and America, it turned out, was ready to hold both simultaneously. Over 200,000 copies of Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, have now sold. For any academic press, that number is extraordinary. For the South Dakota Historical Society Press, a regional institution that had never come close to four-figure sales on a single title before November 2014, it is a transformation so complete that the press before and the press after are almost different institutions. The media coverage that followed the sellout was national and sustained. NPR ran multiple segments. The Smithsonian Magazine published a feature. The New York Times not only added it to the bestseller list, but ran analysis of what the publication represented for American literary culture. For the first time since 1932, when Little House in the Big Woods had appeared and captured an audience hungry for the comfort it provided, the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder was generating news that had nothing to do with sunbonnets. Scholars who had spent careers publishing articles about Pioneer Girl in journals with circulation numbers measured in the hundreds now watched as the general reading public independently arrived at conclusions the academic community had known for decades. That the books and the life were not the same thing. That the collaboration between Laura and Rose had been more complex and more contested than the public narrative acknowledged. That the frontier mythology of pure individual self-reliance was a construction rather than a documentary. What had required institutional credentials and archival access and professional training to know in 1993, when William Holtz's book had made the case in academic language for an academic audience, was now available at the airport bookstore for $39.95 and arriving as a revelation to readers who had never had occasion to set foot in an archive. 3 years after the publication of Pioneer Girl, a writer named Carolyn Fraser accomplished what no single scholarly work had yet achieved. She put the entire story of Laura Ingalls Wilder's life, the frontier years, the failed farms, the collaboration with Rose, the Depression-era mythology making, the suppression and everything in between, into a single, comprehensive, rigorously sourced biographical narrative written for a general audience. Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls. Wilder was published by Metropolitan Books in October 2017. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2018. What Fraser did that no previous work had done was hold every thread of the story simultaneously. Laura's actual frontier experience, Rose's political project, the economic desperation that drove both women into their collaboration, the ideological framework that the books imposed on memories that had originally resisted ideology, and the cultural machinery that had turned a children's series into a national creation myth. She treated Laura with both affection and rigour, which is the hardest combination to achieve in biography, and the only one that serves the subject honestly. Prairie Fires brought the full weight of the Pioneer Girl revelations to an audience even wider than the annotated autobiography had reached. Readers who might not have wanted to spend $39.95 on a scholarly edition with footnotes, but who would absolutely read a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography. Laura Ingalls Wilder's story, in its full and complicated truth, was now in the mainstream of American literary and cultural conversation in a way it had never managed to reach before. The myth was not destroyed. The books were not cancelled. Millions of copies still moved off shelves every year. Children still grew up with them. Teachers still assigned them. But the conversation around them had changed permanently. You could no longer discuss the Little House books without, at some point, accounting for what Pioneer Girl contained. The mythology and the truth now had to coexist in the same cultural space, and finding a way to hold both, the genuine literary achievement and the historical erasure, the beloved story and the suppressed one, was now every reader's private project. In June of 2018, the American Library Association held its annual conference. On the agenda was a decision that the Children's and Young Adult Services Division had been deliberating for months, a decision about an award that the ALA had established 64 years earlier, in 1954. and that had borne the same name for every one of those 64 years, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, given to recognise an author or illustrator whose books had made a substantial and lasting contribution to literature for children. Laura herself had been the first recipient. The list of subsequent honorees read like a roll call of 20th century American children's literature's most celebrated names. The ALLA voted to rename it. The award became the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's name was removed from the honour she had inaugurated, the honour that had been her professional crowning achievement, the honour that had been affixed to her legacy for more than 6 decades. The specific reason given was the racial content in the Little House books, particularly in Little House on the Prairie, where Laura had written Ma uttering a line that had been troubling readers, teachers and scholars for decades. The line, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." That sentence appears in the published book attributed to Caroline Ingalls. It is a direct quotation of a phrase that circulated widely in post-Civil War frontier culture, a phrase associated with the Indian Wars and the systematic destruction of indigenous communities that made white settlement of the Great Plains possible. Ma says it. Pa pushes back mildly. The exchange moves on, the book continues. But the sentence remained on the page in every edition for more than 8 decades, in a book taught in elementary school classrooms across the country as an authentic, warm, historically illuminating portrait of frontier life. The ALA's decision acknowledged publicly and institutionally that this was not an acceptable legacy for the highest honour in American children's librarianship to carry. Not because the books had no value. The ALA was explicit that the renaming was not a call for removal or banning, but because the name of the award represented the values the institution aspired to, and a legacy that included that sentence could not, in 2018, represent those values without qualification. Here is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple narrative of enlightenment would allow. Because the racism in the Little House books was not something Rose Wilder Lane introduced. It was not something that slipped past an inattentive editorial eye, and it was not something that a better editor could have caught, because Rose shared the attitudes entirely. Pioneer Girl contains its own racist descriptions of the Osage people. The child Laura, as she remembered herself in 1930, describes the Osage community with language that is dehumanizing by the standards of any era with the moral vocabulary to assess it, describing them as animal-like, demanding a native baby as if the child were a collectible, absorbing without apparent discomfort the white settler community's consensus that the indigenous population of the Kansas Territory was an obstacle rather than a people. Rose did not remove this content because she did not disagree with it. The 2 women who collaborated on the Little House books carried the racial attitudes of their time, their upbringing and their cultural formation. What minor revisions occurred in the published books over the decades, the softening of some of the most egregious passages, happened not in the 1930s and 1940s, when Rose was editing, but in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s, or when subsequent Harper editors and publishers made quiet adjustments to the text in response to growing awareness of what the original contained. This fact matters enormously for how we understand the books, for 2 reasons. First, it means the racism in the Little House series is not a corruption of Laura's original text by an outside editor. It is continuous with what Laura wrote in Pioneer Girl. The books are, in their racial attitudes, an authentic expression of how the Ingalls family actually saw the indigenous people whose land they were occupying. There is no version of the story in which that vision is restored to something more honest. The honest version is the one Pioneer Girl contains, and it is worse. Second, it means that the ALA's 2018 decision was not simply a reaction to Rose's interventions, or the publishing industry's choices. It was a reckoning with Laura herself, with the woman whose name the award had carried, whose actual voice Pioneer Girl had finally delivered to the public. The decision acknowledged that what Pioneer Girl revealed was not only that the books had been sanitized of poverty and violence and failure, it also revealed that the racism had never been sanitized at all. It had been present all along, in the original, in the voice that appeared on the tablets, or in the E that became Laura when Rose sat down at the typewriter in 1930. That is the hardest thing Pioneer Girl's publication asked America to hold. not the darkness of the frontier. Americans had made peace with the idea that the pioneer era was difficult, but the racism embedded in the documents that had defined pioneer identity for generations, in the foundational text of an entire American mythology, that required something more than acknowledgement. It required a change in how the books were taught, discussed and contextualized, and it required honesty about what they were, the product of real lives, real attitudes, real historical blindness, and real literary genius, all inseparable from each other. Between 2014 and 2023, the South Dakota Historical Society Press completed what it had started with the annotated Autobiography. In 2021, Nancy Teestad Copel edited Pioneer Girl: The Revised Texts, a volume that for the first time laid out all three of Rose's typescript revisions side by side with the original manuscript, making visible in documentary detail the progressive transformation that had taken the handwritten tablets to the books on the shelf. For scholars and general readers alike, this volume was in some ways the most viscerally clarifying document of the entire Pioneer Girl project. You could see, on the same page, what Laura had written and what Rose had made of it. You could track which words survived the editing and which were replaced, which scenes were compressed and which were expanded, which ideological insertions appeared in the second typescript that were absent from the first. The transformation was no longer an argument made by a scholar or a controversy debated in journals. It was simply there, in parallel columns, legible to any reader who chose to look. In 2023, Pioneer Girl: The Path into Fiction extended the analysis one step further, tracing the specific passage from Pioneer Girl's content into the published children's books, showing precisely which memories became which chapters, which sentences were kept and which were dropped, which moments of real life were preserved in the fiction and which were permanently sealed in the tablets. The Pioneer Girl project, now essentially complete across 4 volumes of scholarship spanning 9 years, Hasse had accomplished something that the 1930s publishing industry had declared impossible. It had found an audience for the truth that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote in pencil on school tablets in the spring of 1930. Not in spite of its complexity and darkness, but because of them. Because the readers of 2014 and 2021 and 2023 were not the Depression-era audience that had needed the myth above all. They were readers who had grown up with the myth, who had loved it, and who were now ready to love the truth alongside it, not in replacement, but in addition. The debate about whether to continue teaching the Little House books in American elementary schools has not resolved neatly, and it will not resolve neatly, because the question it poses is not simple. The books have extraordinary literary merit. They build readers. They generate in children a love of story, an engagement with history, an emotional investment in characters that can endure for a lifetime. The millions of women who grew up reading them and who carried them into adulthood and who handed them to their own daughters understand this not as an abstract principle, but as a felt fact of their reading lives. They also contain content, racial attitudes, historical falsifications, ideological erasures that, without critical framing, either teaches children a version of American history that is not just incomplete, but actively misleading about whose land the frontier actually was, whose labour built it, and who paid the price for the mythology that celebrated it. The scholarly consensus developed across 2 decades of post-Pioneer Girl research is that the answer is neither uncritical celebration nor removal. It is critical teaching, the practice of reading the books alongside Pioneer Girl, alongside the historical record of indigenous dispossession and frontier failure and government assistance, alongside the story of how the books were made and why they were made the way they were. It is teaching children not just what the story says, but how stories get constructed, whose interests they serve, what they include and what they leave out and why. That kind of teaching is harder than handing a child Little House in the Big Woods and letting the warmth and the fiddle music and the lamplight do their work. It requires more of the teacher and more of the student. But it produces something that uncritical reading cannot. A reader who understands that every story is a choice, that every myth is a construction. and that the most powerful stories are the ones worth examining most carefully because their power is precisely what gives them the capacity to do harm when left unexamined. There is a question at the centre of this entire story that Pioneer Girl does not answer. It is the question that every reader eventually arrives at, somewhere in the middle of the annotations, and somewhere in the space between what Laura wrote and what America chose to read for 84 years. Did Laura make the right choice? She chose the myth. She chose it deliberately, with full intelligence, at age 64, in full knowledge of what the choice required. She helped build the most beloved children's book series in American history. She achieved literary fame at an age when most writers are long past their public careers. She secured financial stability for herself and her husband in their last decades. She gave millions of children a story that made them love reading and love history, and love the idea of a family that could withstand anything the land threw at them. And she buried Freddie. She buried the Destitute Declaration. She buried the Burr Oak Year and the kerosene and the man who burned and the woman who was dragged by her hair. She helped construct a mythology that became so dominant and so deeply embedded in American cultural identity that it shaped for generations how Americans understood their own past. A past that was, in the original, considerably more complicated, considerably more human, and considerably more honest than the one that became famous. Whether that trade was worth it is not a question with a clean answer. It is a question that Pioneer Girl's publication has made impossible to avoid, and that is precisely its most important contribution to American culture. Not the revelations themselves, dramatic as they are, but the act of forcing the question into the open, of requiring every reader who has ever loved those books to hold, simultaneously, the love and the loss, the achievement and the erasure, the woman who wrote the truth in 1930 and the woman who helped bury it in 1932, and the way those two women were the same person, living inside the same impossible set of choices. She was human. The frontier was human. America's mythology of it was human, built by people under pressure, in need of money, operating in a cultural landscape that rewarded warmth and punished complexity. None of them were villains. All of them made choices that had consequences their originators could not fully anticipate. The consequences have lasted nearly a century. They are still unfolding, and Pioneer Girl, 400 pages of pencil handwriting, are lying in a drawer for 84 years, is the document that ensures they will continue to unfold honestly, with the full record available for every generation that chooses to read it. Before we close, there is one more thing you need to know. Everything you have heard in this series, the frontier years, the Burr Oak darkness, Rose's red pen, the myth and the making of it, all of it is the story Laura told about her own childhood. The story she controlled, curated, and ultimately chose to present to the world in the form the world accepted. But there is a chapter of her life that even Pioneer Girl barely touched. A chapter that happened after the school tablets were put away, after the marriage and the years of failed farming and the fires and the losses. A chapter about a man who shaped everything she was and everything she became, and whose death, in the summer of 1902, required Laura to make a journey across more than 600 miles of American landscape, from the farm in Missouri she had finally managed to build, back to the South Dakota town she had left years before. Charles Philip Ingalls, Pa, the man who played the fiddle, the man who moved the family 17 times and signed the Destitute Declaration, and became, in the books his daughter wrote, the greatest American father the frontier ever produced. By 1902, he was 65 years old and living in De Smet, South Dakota, and his heart, the one that had carried him through blizzards and grasshopper plagues, and a life of relentless physical labour on land that had repeatedly refused to give back what he put in, his heart was failing. And when the telegram arrived at Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri, Laura would have to decide how fast she could move, whether the trains could get her there, whether the roads and the miles and the distance between the life she had built and the father she was losing could be covered in time, whether she would make it before the fiddle music stopped. That story begins in our next video. How Pa Ingalls actually died. Charles Ingalls' final years and the funeral Laura almost missed.